Did you know that Diego Maradona knocked a guy out in a Barça uniform? Did you know that the Barcelona versus Real Madrid rivalry started with just one match way back in 1943? Most Kool-Aids know the big stuff, the stuff of the iceberg that's always on social media and always right in front of your face. But the story of FC Barcelona is so much more than that. Robbie had you covered in part 1 of our 2-part series, and he's handed over to me to handle part 2. We're going to continue our deep dive into the darkness below, what you think you know about FC Barcelona. And if you're new here, welcome to the Barcelona Podcast Universe. Subscribe to the channel, follow the podcast, help me out on Patreon, check out the merch store, or follow me on social media. All right, let's dive in. I'm going to throw some words at you. Diego Maradona, revenge, Kung Fu Kick, Butcher of Bilbao, Riot Police, Copa del Rey Final. Somehow that story has almost largely been lost to time. But the way Diego Maradona's Barcelona career ended is not the way that Maradona or the club would have wanted to celebrate. One of the all-time greatest players in history, Diego Maradona, he's in my top 5, which is Messi, Pelé, Maradona, Cruyff, and Beckenbauer, if anyone's asking. With Zidane, R9, Cristiano Ronaldo, Platini, and Paolo Maldini, as well as Di Stefano, being in no particular order in that next group. But that's not what this is all about. This is about Maradona's last match for Barcelona. Here's what you need to know going in. Anthony Goicoechea, or the Butcher of Bilbao, broke Maradona's ankle in 1983, which, along with his bouts with hepatitis, made Maradona's time at Barcelona less than enjoyable. And Maradona held a grudge. At the Santiago Bernabeu, it was an intense atmosphere between Athletic Club and Barcelona for the Copa del Rey final. But it wasn't necessarily a contentious one between the two sets of fans. Athletic Club versus Barcelona in the Copa del Rey final in 1984, both fans actually booed the national anthem prior to kickoff. There was a shared rebellious connection between the two fan bases, and all the animosity and intensity was about who was going to win the match on the field. But unfortunately, as I already set up, any unity in the stands was not on the field. There were moments in the match that caused tension, including a tackle on Maradona's ankle and another tackle on Barcelona midfielder Bernd Schuster. The match was more of a wrestling match than the beautiful game. Ndika scored the only goal of the game, so the eventual winner for Athletic Club, in the 14th minute on a failed clearance from a corner. It was future Barca Dream Team keeper Anthony Zubizarreta who prevented Barcelona from getting their equalizer. As a final whistle sounded and Athletic Club coaches and substitutes stormed the field to celebrate, what sparked Maradona's rage is still contested. Some say that he was dealing with racist insults from Bilbao fans the entire game related to his father's Native American ancestry. And from Maradona's camp, they say that unused substitute Miguel Angel Sola used a xenophobic term and made an insulting gesture at Maradona, which on top of not getting the revenge he longed for, sent Maradona over the edge. What is certain is that Maradona headbutted Sola and the ball broke out. Maradona started punching and kicking like a toddler possessed and much, much more violent. When Sola fell to the ground, Maradona kneed him in the face and knocked him out. He was stretchered away as Maradona and Bernd Schuster, at the center of it all, saw both teams brawling until Riot Police could break it up and get the Barcelona players off the field. And in the aftermath, even if Maradona wanted to stay, which with his public feuding with Barcelona president Josep Luis Núñez was highly unlikely, but after the brawl, it was no longer up to him. Barcelona was done with him. The brawl took place with Spanish King Juan Carlos and 100,000 people in attendance, and more than half of Spanish TVs were tuned in. 60 people were injured, fans threw projectiles that hit players, coaches, photographers, and others, and from a Barcelona perspective, it was a shameful event after a Copa del Rey loss. Of course, you don't celebrate that. But the big deal is that it was the last match Diego Maradona, torn shirt and all, played for Barcelona. He would go on, of course, to have great success at Napoli, who bought him for a world record fee of 6.9 million euros a few weeks later. Okay, so we did start with a pretty negative all-time greats, but I think I need Robbie's help to bring back the positive vibes.
Wait, look, everybody yelling at me, La Masia should be in the first tier. I understand that, but there is so much more to the beginnings of La Masia than so many people realize. Obviously, Johan Cruyff founded La Masia, called up a skinny Pep Guardiola, and the rest is history. Right? Actually, no. Youth football at Barcelona goes all the way back to Luis D'Osso, who captained a second team in 1901. From there, third and fourth teams were added, and there was always much more talk about adding more youth football. But in 1961, the same president that would become known for the Més que un club motto, Enric Laudet, campaigned on a desire to create a residential youth academy. But just 2 years later, in 1963, financial issues, shocker, caused the club to have to shut down the residential youth academy. The building it was housed in, by the way, was a farmhouse La Masia, that the eventual residential youth academy would be named after. But Barcelona kept trying. Jumping ahead again to Josep Luis Núñez in 1978, he pushed forward with the ideas of a youth facility yet again. And the managers of Barcelona get the credit for pushing youngsters into the first team. But it's forgotten names that deserve the real credit. Joan Vila, a man who became the director of methodology and stayed at the club until 2018, and Oriol Tort, maybe the most important scout in Barcelona's history, were all major figures in the academy's origins. In 1979, the Socios finally agreed to move forward with the youth academy, and it was opened in 1982. There was a major emphasis at the time to blend school and football and find a way to balance that in their childhood. Things like that are universal now, but at the time, it was groundbreaking. In 1988, though they would grow to dislike each other, Núñez put Johan Cruyff in charge of the first team, and he brought with him everything he learned about youth development and philosophy from the Ajax Academy team. Rinus Michels gave him many of his ideas, but Cruyff relied heavily on the work of Laureano Ruiz, who had been the Juvenil A coach in 1972. Ruiz pushed for the 3-4-3 formation to be used across all the Barcelona teams, from the top all the way to the bottom. So yeah, while his ideas are tier 1, the impact of Laureano Ruiz is essential to Barcelona, even though his name is not well known. Cruyff built upon Ruiz's ideas and created the system that would succeed, but Ruiz still deserves credit for what he did and what he contributed to La Masia. But if we are being honest, the hardest part of the entire process is taking the ideas and creating something that you can succeed with in the first team, and that's exactly what Cruyff was able to do. Cruyff was also pretty aggressive with his promotion of young players into the first team, with the likes of Pep Guardiola and Albert Ferrer having significant contributions to that dream team. However, there is one young player that a lot of culés forget about or don't know about at all, but I'll let Dan handle that one.
Just because La Masia came to strength in the latter half of the 20th century, that doesn't mean Barca didn't have some great young players at the start of the 20th century. I almost get a bit disappointed when culés don't know who Paulino Alcantara is. Nicknamed the Netbuster, he was Barcelona's first actual superstar. Born in the Philippines in 1896 to a Spanish military father and a Filipino mother, his father moved the family to Barcelona when Paulino was 3 due to the Philippine Revolution. That same year, 1899, Juan Gamper was founding FC Barcelona. The story goes that Alcantara was playing for local side FC Galeno, and Gamper liked what he saw and brought him to FC Barcelona. Not long after, he debuted for the first team at the age of 15 years, 4 months, and 18 days, becoming the youngest ever to score for FC Barcelona. For context, Lamine Yamal was 2 months too old to break that record when he was first called up. It was also a hat trick, by the way, a 9-0 win against Català CS in the Catalan Football Championship, also making him the first ever Asian or Pacific Islander to feature for a European team. As a teenager from 1912 to 1916, he won 2 Catalan Football Championships and the 1913 Copa del Rey. But then his family moved back to the Philippines in 1916, with Alcantara still barely college age, and he attended college to become a doctor. He played for Bohemian Sporting Club and the Philippines national team, leading them to a 15-2 win over Japan at the Far Eastern Championship Games in Tokyo in 1917. But then, in another weird twist of fate, Alcantara contracted malaria. Unrelated, FC Barcelona weren't having the success they wanted without him, and they tried to bring him back, to no avail from his parents, who wanted him to focus on his medical studies. But as any rational young man who loves football would do, he refused to treat his malaria unless his parents allowed him to return to Catalonia. They relented, and FC Barcelona had their star back. And unsurprisingly, the trophies returned as well. Well, not immediately, actually, because teammate Jack Greenwell was now manager, and he had the idea to put Alcantara on the back line, something that the Socios were not too happy about. So much like his parents, Greenwell relented, and Alcantara was back up top. And Alcantara's legend began to grow. Within weeks of returning, he scored the legendary police goal against Real Sociedad. Alcantara apparently smacked a shot so hard that he sent both the ball and a policeman into the net. Now, unfortunately, the truth is that the Socios of the time did fib a little bit, because the shot wasn't on net and no goal was given. But the policeman standing nearby was likely none the wiser after being on the receiving end of this powerful shot. He began to draw crowds that were too big for the Camp Industria, which is Barcelona's home field, forcing the club to move to the larger Les Corts, a similar story to Kubala and Camp Nou. Then in 1922, he got the nickname Netbuster, Trencassara in Catalan or El Romperedes in Spanish, when he tore through the net with a goal for Spain against France. Along with other legends like Josep Samitier, Emili Sagi Barba, and Ricardo Zamora, among other stars at the time, Alcantara led Barca's first golden generation, at least in my opinion, their first golden generation. They won 8 Catalan championships out of 9 and 4 Copa del Reys. He scored 395 goals in 399 games, scoring many of those with his famous white handkerchief hanging out of his pocket. If there is one player Kool-Aids need to know from the first 50 years of the club, not named Gunpair, it's Paulino Alcantara. I'm glad we talked about Alcantara because the next guy Kool-Aids need to know is Laszlo Kubala, the guy I would say was the next super-duper star for the club. And he ushered in an era of winning, one season in particular Barca fans should know about. Before there was Guardiola and the sextuple, there was Barca of the 5 Cups, when Barcelona won all 5 possible trophies between 1951 and 1952. They won the League, the Spanish Cup, the Latin Cup, and the Copa Ivo Duarte, as well as the Copa Martini Rossi. With Anthony Ramallets in net and Gustavo Biosca leading a defense that also included a young future captain, Juan Segarra, Chechi Martin, and Josep Seguer, Barca had the joint best defense in the league, Barca and Real Madrid conceding just 43 apiece in the league. But it was the attack that led them to the titles. With Maria Gonzalvo and Andra Bosch joining the attack from the midfield, a front three of Cesar Rodriguez, Barca's second all-time scorer, Laszlo Kubala, Barcelona's 4th all-time scorer, and Estanislao Basora, Barca's 12th all-time scorer, they pushed Barcelona to 92 goals in 30 matches in the league, 12 more goals than anybody else. And that's because they also had some help. Eduardo Machon, Jordi Villa, and Tomas Hernandez, known as Moreno, were also major goal scorers and would have even been bigger goal scorers for any other team in the league. The Copa Ivo Duarte was the competition played between the Liga winners and Copa del Rey, then known as the Copa del Generalissimo, and so Barcelona was actually awarded the trophy without a match in both 1952 and 1953 because they had won the Liga Copa del Rey double. The Copa Martini and Rossi was pretty much the precursor to the Juan Gamper trophy, as it was a single glorified match between Barcelona and another European team in Barcelona. In June of 1952, Barca beat Nice 2-0, and then in December, they beat Kickers Offenbach of Germany 5-2. In May of 1952, they beat Valencia 4-2 in the Copa del Generalissimo, now the Copa del Rey. The big dogs, Basora, Villa, Kubala, and Cesar had those goals in the 4-2 win. And lastly, there was the Latin Cup, which was a top European cup of the day, predating the UEFA Cup and what is now the Champions League. Barca, having qualified as the champions of Spain, won the 1952 title after a 4-2 win over Juventus in the semis and a 1-0 win over Nice in the final. Cesar Rodriguez with the lone goal in the 80th minute. The manager of that legendary Barca side was Ferdinand Dauschik, who became Barca coach in 1950 as part of Kubala's contract that brought him to Barcelona. Why the favoritism? Well, Dauschik was Kubala's brother-in-law. Kubala had married his sister 3 years earlier. So when Barca legend in his own right, Semetier, who at the time was the chief scout for the club, saw Kubala while he was playing for Hungaria, a team made up of refugees from across Eastern Europe, Semetier reportedly made the deal work through his connection with General Franco, the connection that would get him accused of being a spy during the Di Stefano transfer just months later. And that, my dear friends, is a series of contradictions. But anyway, the too long didn't read for this one, Barca of the 5 Cups. Kubala was really good and helped Barca get back to winning trophies after a rough time after the Spanish Civil War. This winning led to more success with the signing of the Spanish Luis Suarez and the opening of the Camp Nou in 1957. But I think it's finally time to add some color to at least some of the pictures, a lot of black and white here, and more importantly, have Robbie tell you about the kidnapping of a Barcelona player, which is a crazy story too.
Now, Dan, I know you've covered this story on your channel before, but I don't think a lot of people understand how crazy this story actually is. Just imagine a player being kidnapped for 25 days and then that kidnapping having an effect on the title race. Well, that's exactly what happened when legendary striker Enrique Quini Castro, a player from Sporting Gijon from 1968 to 1980, who's both their all-time goal scorer and their namesake for their stadium, was kidnapped. Today, he is remembered as a kind and humble man, but he has had to deal with so much adversity in his life. We're about to talk about his kidnapping, but he also had throat cancer when he went back to be sporting director at Sporting Gijon, and he even lost his brother in 1993 at the age of 42, who died while rescuing 2 boys and their father from drowning. This is a man who had to deal with so much more in his life than any of us can ever imagine. But what did he have to do with FC Barcelona? Well, he actually signed with Barcelona in the summer of 1980, helping them win the 1981 Copa del Rey, scoring twice against his old Sporting Gijon in the final. But that's at the end of this story, because less than 3 months before that, he had been held captive for 25 days. On the night of March 1st, after scoring 2 goals in a 6-0 win, he was kidnapped by 2 men at gunpoint while stopped at a gas station. The 2 men showed him a Colt 45 gun and then told him to get in his car and he would be followed by a van. Then he was taken into the van and a hood was put over his head. His car was left abandoned, where the police would end up finding it the next day, all while Quini was taken to a small cell under the floor in a garage in Zaragoza with his 3 kidnappers. His wife was left waiting for him at the airport in Barcelona, but obviously he never arrived. She had flown back from Asturias that afternoon, and when he didn't arrive, she called the police. So you know when a dog finally catches a car, but then he doesn't know what to do with it? That's exactly what the kidnappers were like with Quini. They caught him, but they didn't know what to do with him. They didn't have a real plan as to how they would carry out getting the ransom or how they planned to deal with the famous man that they had just kidnapped. In reality, they were unemployed handymen, and the kidnapping was much more about getting some money than it ever was anything personal towards Quini. And it was this poor organization that would end up being their undoing. They disagreed and balked at the ransom number, 350 million pesetas, 100 million pesetas, and it was Quini who suggested to them to call his wife to begin the conversation of that ransom. They did threaten Quini, but it was very empty promises. Nothing was ever executed against him, and he was treated okay. They even gave the guy sandwiches. The 25 days seemed to happen more due to their incompetence than a master kidnapping scheme. Eventually, Barça captain at the time, José Ramón Alexandro, delivered the ransom of 100 million pesetas into a Swiss bank account with the promise that Quini wouldn't be harmed. When that money was withdrawn on March 25th, coupled with a lead on a van in Zaragoza, the police found the garage and Quini's cell underneath it in the same day. Quini, in all his kindness, didn't press charges against them, didn't claim the damages against them, and everything seemed good. Everything was moving forward for everyone except FC Barcelona, because without Quini, the team struggled. The squad drew once and lost 4 times without him in it, and they fell out of the title race, finishing 5th in La Liga that season. Quini did end up recovering, and he helped the team win the Copa del Rey, and he was actually the club's leading goal scorer by the end of that season. Thankfully, Quini is remembered today much more for what he did on the pitch than for what happened to him in those 25 days off of it. The story's crazy, and so it deserves a mention. However, we need to move deeper into this iceberg and learn a little bit more about FC Barcelona. So back to Dan to do that.
Okay, so now we're entering Tier 4, and the stories that only the hardcore Kool-Aids would probably know. And that's why I'm starting Tier 4 talking about Josep Boter Mas. I already covered him on my channel, but I mentioned him again because he was actually someone that in some ways tried to be forgotten, but I like to try to stop that from happening every chance I get. Josep Boter Mas might have been the greatest scout Barça ever had, mostly because you can draw a straight line from Josep Boter Mas to La Masia today. So if this is your first time hearing that name, who was he? He was brought to FC Barcelona in 1925, having been working with the Catalan Football Federation since he was 16 years old. He took over the junior system in 1934 from President Juan Coma, who would soon resign after 3 trophyless seasons. Starting in his first year with the club, he recruited local talent Ramon Llorens, and it worked out so well that the club made him an official scout, trusting him to literally bring in players off the street. Josep Escola, the club's 10th all-time scorer, and Josep Reis, a longtime midfielder for the club, were his first 2 official signings. His legacy was really written because the club was in financial trouble following the Spanish Civil War, and through so much of the 1930s through the 1970s, finding high-level talent for cheap was essential for Barcelona to keep pace. If you were paying attention to Tier 3 and the Barça of the 5 Cups, you'll already know the names Basora, Bachon, Bosch, Seguer, and Segarra. But after that, he also brought in Carlos Reixac, Josep Maria Fuste, Justo Tejada, and Ferran Oliveira, as well as Elogio Martinez. And those are just some of the names. He scouted a ton of the players on the benches that filled out those rosters throughout the decades. But it was his kindness that really made it all work. He cared about not only the talent of the players, but also the intangibles too. He looked for touch with both feet and good ball control, plus how they dressed, their body language off the field and on the field, and their manners. And the youngsters that fit that description were taken care of. He would take the players out to eat, he would wait for trains for them, and he would take them to fancy restaurants when they couldn't get home for the holidays. I almost consider him the grandfather of La Masia, because the threads are right there. Llorens, the first player he scouted, was his right-hand man for close to 40 years after he stopped playing. Escola and Josep Sementier became scouts next to him, and Oriol Tort, probably the greatest Barca scout you need to know, was under the tutelage of Josep Boter Mas. And Reixac, the guy who signed Messi on the napkin way back in Tier 1 with Robbie, yeah, I'll remind you again who signed Reixac. The reason he isn't remembered is because, 1, there's no video, 2, there's no pictures, and 3, he didn't really look for the recognition, and he died out of the public eye. As players got older, Boter moved farther and farther away from the player. He had done his job. He retired from the club in 1973 due to poor health, and the club held a tribute match for him right after they signed Johan Cruyff, and more than 80 players took part in the tribute match. Near the end of his life, he dealt with financial difficulties and died in a great deal of debt at the age of 72. A 1-minute moment of silence at a youth match was the final way he was honored. But fortunately, today we have the technology and the curiosity to continue to remember him, and I hope in perpetuity. Now let's play the what if game again, but this time down here in Tier 4. Robbie talked about Di Stefano and that big what if, but Barca could have had a much different history, even without Di Stefano. In the 6th season of the European Cup, Barca and Real Madrid both actually qualified. Barca as the reigning La Liga winners, and Real Madrid as the reigning European Cup champions. Barca beat Lierse of Belgium in the preliminary rounds, and then they took down Real Madrid 2-2 and 2-1 over the 2 legs in the first round. Spanish Luis Suarez scored both goals in the first leg at the Santiago Bernabeu, and Martin Verges and Evaristo scored the goals back at the Camp Nou. A late goal by Real Madrid's Canario made it interesting, but Barca held on in front of the 90,000 fans. With Los Blancos vanquished, Barcelona crushed Spartak Hradec Kralov from the current Czech Republic 5-1 on aggregate. Justo Tejada had a brace, and Evaristo and Kubala scored the other goals in the 4-0 win at the Camp Nou. Then in Prague, Luis Suarez scored in the 1-1 draw. In the semis, it came down to a playoff with Hamburg. Barca won the first leg 1-0 behind Evaristo's goal at the Camp Nou, but Hamburg answered with a 2-1 win over Barca in Germany. If not for Sendo Kosic's 90-minute goal, Barca would have never even had a playoff. But he did, and Evaristo's goal at a neutral stadium in Brussels sent Barca to the final in 1961. What a great journey to the European Cup final it was. A story that I bet Kool-Aids would know better if the result had gone differently. In front of about 27,000 fans in Bern, Switzerland, remember, these finals didn't have the fanfare they do now, Barca fell to Benfica 3-2. Kosic put the Blaugrana up early, but 3 goals from Benfica, the first from the tournament's leading goal scorer, Jose Aguas, 1 from an error from Barca's goalkeeper, Ramayets, and then 1 from Maradona Coluna, a Portuguese legend who is the greatest player to ever be born in Mozambique, scored the third. Zoltan Zibor got one back, but it wasn't enough, and Barca missed out on European glory in their first attempt. What if Barca had won that trophy, which would have automatically qualified them for the next year's competition? Because the next year's final, Benfica beating Real Madrid. Real Madrid would be Spain's only representative in the competition until 1966, when Atletico Madrid qualified as the Liga champions, and Real Madrid qualified as, again, the reigning European Cup winners. Real Madrid would still have won some of those trophies, of course, but already having won European Cup in 1961 would have been a bit for Barcelona's history starting at that point. And this story repeated itself 25 years later in Seville in 1986. In the first round, Barca had beaten Sparta Prague 2-1 behind a brace from Paco Clos, using those away goals to qualify on aggregate after losing 1-0 back at the Camp Nou. In the round of 16, they snuck by Porto also on away goals. They won 2-0 at the Camp Nou. Marcos Alonso's dad, named Marcos Alonso, and Bernd Schuster had the goals. Then a hat trick from Porto's Yari would have been enough for the Portuguese team, but Steve Archibald's goal was enough for the 3-3 aggregate win. In the quarterfinals, Barca knocked out defending champions Juventus behind Julio Alberto's goal for the 1-0 win at the Camp Nou and Archibald's goal for the 1-1 in Turin to cancel out Platini's goal for Juve. In the semis, they stuck by IFK Göteborg on penalties, and they did it in comeback fashion. An awful 3-0 loss in Sweden in the first leg meant that they needed 3 goals just to get to extra time, and they couldn't concede an away goal. Well, behind Pichi's hat trick, they got those 3 goals and forced penalties. In penalties, they went down 3-2, but made their final 3 as Göteborg missed their final 2, and they moved on 5-4. Even though they hadn't dominated anybody on their way there, they were still the favorites in the final against Romanian side Steaua Bucharest. Led by manager Terry Venables, Barca had the better players. Captain Jose Ramon Alexanco and Migueli brought leadership to the back. Schuster and Victor Munoz in the midfield with plenty of that 80s physicality. Angel Pedraza and Marcos Alonso on the wings, and Steve Archibald up top. They were the better side, but not on that night. Unable to get a goal, the match came down to penalties. Helmut Dukadam became the hero of Seville as he stopped all 4 Barca penalties and the Romanian club won their first and only European Cup. But if we're playing the what-if game, losing that final might have led to the best of times. That frustration was added to the frustration that Schuster already had with multiple figures at the club, especially President Josep Luis Núñez. The players rebelled, affectionately known as the Hesperia Mutiny. Schuster went to Real Madrid after 14 of the 26 players were dismissed from the club within the next 2 years. And to play that what-if game even farther, do you know who Núñez brought in as that big hire to fix it all? A guy named Johan Cruyff. Down here in Tier 4, there is another name that I think Kool-Aid should know, especially as we just had Women in Sports Day last week, and that's Ana Maria Martinez, Barca's first female board director. I've also covered her on my channel, but any new Kool-Aids who've gone on this Iceberg adventure with Robbie and I should know her name too. Until Alexia Putellas, Aitana Manbani, and Mapi Leon came along, Ana Maria Martinez Sagi was probably the most important woman in Barcelona's history. While she was a poet, a journalist, and an accomplished athlete, Kool-Aid should know her as the first woman to join FC Barcelona's board of directors. Her father was a Barca executive and served as the club's treasurer from 1917 to 1919. Her brother Armando was the youngest ever to debut for Barcelona until Ansu Fati and Lamine Yamal. And her cousin, Emilio Sagi Barba, was already mentioned in this video as a teammate of Cementir and Paulino Alcantara. By 1913, Blanqueper had changed the statutes to include women as members due to the presence of a woman named Edelmiro Calvedo, who was the first woman to become a Barca member after basically being the first woman to regularly come to the matches alongside her husband and newborn baby. Because of her, Gamper changed the rules, and not too many years later, Martinez Sagi came along, becoming a board member at the age of 27 during the mid-30s. Martinez Sagi was a bit of a maverick and always willing to go against the status quo. She learned Catalan from a nanny when her parents said that it was for the lower class. She was first published as a poet at 19, writing about radical things of the time such as femininity and women's sports and women's independence. At 27, then club president Josep Sunyol, remember him from Tier 2 of the Iceberg, we are going through the history of Barcelona, he pushed her to join the Barca board, and she was approved unanimously. Her first mission on the board was to create a women's gymnastics section, and she had a lot planned. But it took about a year for her patience to wear thin with the men on the board. They did not allow her to get anything done. They seemed open enough to having a woman on the board, but they weren't willing to listen to her or let her actually do anything. So even though this was her claim to fame, especially for FC Barcelona fans, it wasn't something that she was proud of or spoke about fondly. It's actually something she didn't speak about at all, even decades and decades later. Because it is at this point where her overlap with FC Barcelona pretty much ends. But I would direct you down to the description of this video to the one I already made about her life, because her life was so much more exciting than that year on the Barca board. She was a famous poet in the 30s in Spain, getting national recognition. She was a journalist on the front lines during the Spanish Civil War, and she was reportedly sent back to Barcelona after getting shrapnel in her legs. Then she would go back to war, then get sent back, and she had the bravery or insanity, whatever you want to call it, to repeat that process. She joined the French resistance during World War II and escaped the Gestapo through the window of her apartment. She was a big deal in the perfume industry in the 1950s, and she taught as a professor at the University of Illinois in the United States. She lived out the remainder of her days in secret back in Catalonia after the death of General Franco. And those are just some of the stories that can be told about her very, very incredible life. Again, that full story is down in the description. I am getting a little cold down here because we have finally gotten to, I'd say, the bottom of the iceberg. And let's end this big two-part adventure with a story that is quite a doozy. Honestly, with the current call of controversy and referee shenanigans and corruption in the Liga, the story of Barcelona's 11-1 El Clásico loss feels a bit like it belongs in Tier 1, not Tier 4. It is, without hyperbole, the day when Barcelona began to identify as the enemy of the dictatorship, and the rivalry between Real Madrid and FC Barcelona truly began on this day. El Clásico today only exists because of that game in 1943. Without it, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Athletic Club, Atletico Madrid, the teams that have been around and played each other for more than 100 years now, those rivalries might all have the same weight. So let's set the scene. General Franco and his forces had won the Spanish Civil War in 1939, so the Copa del Rey was at that time known as the Copa del Generalísimo. It was a semifinal of the competition between Real Madrid and Barcelona. Defending champions Barça had won the first leg 3-0 at Les Corts, behind goals from Valles Mas, Josep Escola, and Sospedra, and things were looking good. Except for referee Fombona Fernandez, that is, who Madrid complained allowed Barcelona to be too physical and was influenced by the aggressive whistling of the Catalan supporters. The Madrid media implored Real Madrid fans to return the favor, and they did. Barcelona supporters were banned from traveling to Madrid, and in hostile territory, The Barcelona squad had stones thrown at their bus the moment they left their hotel. Maria Gonzalez said that 5 minutes before the game had started, our penalty area was already full of coins. The Barcelona captain for that match, Francisco Calvet, said they were shouting, "Reds, separatists." A bottle just missed Saavedra that would have killed him if it had hit him. It was all set up. Intimidation is one thing, but clearly this was another level. Real Madrid went up 2-0 by the 28th minute, which isn't that crazy, and a third was scored, which led to a red card for Benito Garcia. Calvet after the match called it a completely normal tackle. At this point, Real Madrid says that Barcelona got a bit demoralized, and they made it 8-0 by halftime. 2 other Madrid goals also being called offside. 3 more goals came in the second half for Madrid, and Marino Martinez scored a late one for Barcelona to prevent the shutout. Was Real Madrid really that good? They would lose the final to Athletic Bilbao in extra time. The Barcelona president, Enrique Pinheiro, was out by August, having the legacy of being president when Barcelona had to change its name and represent Franco's Spain. For someone who allegedly knew nothing about sport coming in, Pinheiro did at least form the handball, baseball, and cycling teams, so at least that's something. And he also worked to get exiled sportsmen back to Spain, including leading goal scorer Escola. But let's get back to that game. A hostile football atmosphere is one thing, but you get the sense that the hostility was much more than just football. This was intimidation that felt like it was coming from the top down in Spain. And not only did Barcelona players feel that pressure, but so did referee Celestino Rodriguez. 11-1 makes you feel like the players had reason to fear from more than just a loss. As Sid Lowe said, it is not a result that has been particularly celebrated in Madrid. Indeed, the 11-1 occupies a far more prominent role in Barcelona's history. This was the game that first formed the identification of Madrid as a team of the dictatorship and Barcelona as its victims. The best quote from the aftermath, though, came from backup Barca goalkeeper Fernando Arguila. He said, "There was no rivalry, not at least until that game." Congratulations, you finally got to the end, and a big thank you to Robbie for going on this big, grand Iceberg adventure with me and taking on what was a gigantic project for the two of us. I really hope that his viewers, my viewers, and listeners, and maybe some new Kool-Aids or just football fans who love history enjoyed all of this. You can follow Robbie on his YouTube channel and make sure to keep up with everything I got going on with the podcast, the YouTube channel, subscribe if you want already, the Patreon, merch store, social media, the whole 9 yards. And as always, most importantly, especially for the Kool-Aids that went up and all the way down the iceberg, Forza Barça.